Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's talk. My name is George Sirimis. I'm the director of the Hellenic Studies program at the Macmillan Center at Yale University. We are funded generously by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation in New York and Athens, and we're very happy today to hold this event. I have to clarify that we have planned this event long before the events in Ukraine, so it's a tragic coincidence that our talk is happening during the war, but I guess there's some consolation that we are on the pulse of what is happening in Russia and the general area there in the Black Sea, as well as Greece. The way we will conduct today's event, we will have the speaker and the respondent deliver their presentations, and you can, the audience can pose their questions here at the Q&A, and we will also have the chat function open. Excuse me. I have to clarify that we'll probably not be interacting ourselves in the chat room because, well, intellectually I cannot handle two conversations and I would like to listen to the presentation. So feel free to post your comments there for each other. And the questions in the Q&A, which I will read to or the speakers can read them at the end. And before I present our speakers today, I would like to announce our next event. I've kind of improvised a little bit with, I'm sorry, I don't seem to be able to share. Nope. No, so I will just talk about it. Our next event is a dinner and a panel discussion. I have very tentatively called it a tantalizing symposium served without hubris, because it is based on ancient Greek cuisine and the culinary culture. It will be held on April 19th, on Tuesday at 4 p.m., a panel discussion moderated by Paul Friedman from Yale University. And participants are the chef Michael Psilakis, the Greek consular from New York, Kostas Koutras, and the documentarian Phil Buccino, who made a documentary called Abandoned Groves. The next day, those of you that are at Yale and affiliated with the university may have the chance to also watch the documentary by Phil Buccino and some tasting of organic Greek olive oil and Italian, I think. So it will be followed by a dinner, which will be prepared by Michael Psilakis and James Benson from the Yale hospitality team. This will be held at Commons. I think it's sort of closed to the public, but we wanted to announce it anyway. And afterwards, there will be a gathering at the basement of the Schwarzman Center in this place called The Well. So please join us at least for the panel on Tuesday, April 19th, and we will have a more formal announcement once we get the poster out. So today's talk will be delivered by Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou. I'm very happy she's with us today. I think one of our first encounters was in a little chapel in Naxos a couple of 2-3 decades ago, Elizabeth. We had a great time there. But we're now meeting in a more formal setting because Elizabeth is probably the most accomplished specialist in modern Greek studies who studies the church and the contemporary politics around it. She is a faculty member at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and also directs the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. She's, besides being a distinguished academic, she's also a public figure. She's a co-president and a World Council member of Religions for Peace. She has been the co-president since 2019. She has also served at the U.S. Secretary of State's Working Group on Religion and Foreign Policy, and has been a commissioner and vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedoms. Now, this is only a part of her engagement with civil society and religion. Her interest, however, focuses on geopolitics and religion, with a particular focus on the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean and Southern Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the general area from Turkey all the way around to Egypt and Cyprus. She's also a specialist in human rights, international politics and security, negotiations and conflict resolution in the Balkans and the Middle East. This has been a very fertile field in the last decade or so because of all the political and military turmoil in the Middle East and a lot of disruption of religious practices and traditions in the area. In the past, we had held a couple of panel discussions about the Orthodox and Christian populations in the Middle East, and it may be actually time to revisit the topic because it's been quite a few years since we have had a discussion of it. But today we will focus on Greece and Russia, which is part of what Elizabeth has been working recently. She's particularly interested in cultural heritage and institutional religious freedom in Turkey in a comparative context, as well as the Orthodox Eastern Christianity and its global engagement. She has also been publishing profusely articles and editions of books. I just want to mention a couple: Eastern Orthodox Christianity and American Higher Education, which was published in 2017, and previously Thinking Through Faith, New Perspectives from Orthodox Christian Scholars. So in addition to the actual topic, Elizabeth is also interested in the practice of the discipline of the field of religious studies. She comes to it from the perspective of a political scientist, which I think is a fascinating angle. Elizabeth Prodromou holds a PhD from MIT in political science, and I think this is going to be sort of the refreshing approach that she brings to the topics as we have been discussing it recently in our informal conversations about the talk. In response to Professor Prodromou's presentation, we are hosting today also a good friend and colleague from Southern Connecticut State University, Nikolaos Chrysidis. Nikolaos, who also goes by Nikos, if I may, Nico, I'll call you Nikos. He is a professor of Russian history at the Southern Connecticut State University in New Haven. He holds a PhD from Yale University in Russian history and specializes in medieval and early modern Russian history and culture, Greek-Russian cultural context, particularly also the Western influences on Greek and Russian cultures, but especially on indulgences and pilgrimages to the Holy Land, which have been the center of his research recently. So the way we will conduct today's talk, Elizabeth will go first, then Nikos Chrysidis will respond to the presentation, and then we will open the discussion to the public. Okay, so Elizabeth, welcome, and we're all looking forward to this talk today.
Thank you. Thank you for the incredibly generous welcome, George. And yes, let's use first names if we can. Yes. I think we go back 3 decades of friendship, so that's a wonderful thing, and it also speaks to the clock moving forward. But yes, it's really great to be with you, and also thank you to Nico for being here, for offering or agreeing to offer comments on the presentation. And thank you also to the host, the Hellenic Studies Program, and the Macmillan Center's program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and also the European Studies Council at Yale. Please flag me if I think I have about 40 minutes, is that right?
Yes, you're fine, you're fine.
Yeah, please flag me if I go beyond the time, but I'll try to stay within those time boundaries. My presentation today addresses Russia's influence building activities and disruption activities in Greece through the use of soft and sharp power mechanisms that involve religion towards the goal of socio-political and geopolitical objectives in the transatlantic alliance, Russia's objectives vis-a-vis the transatlantic alliance. More specifically, I'm going to develop a set of arguments about the role of the Russian Orthodox Church, which I'll refer to as the Patriarchate of Moscow, as the tip of the spear for religious soft and sharp power influence building activities in Greece. both as this relates to Kremlin and Moscow Patriarchate geopolitical goals for the transatlantic alliance and for global orthodoxy. So I'm going to organize my presentation into 4 parts. First, I want to briefly situate my research on Greece as part of the Kremlin Playbook series that was published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Ours is the 3rd in the series, the Kremlin Playbook 3, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Second, I want to talk about why Greece holds particular significance for Russian, again, both Kremlin and Moscow Patriarchate influence building and disruption in NATO and the Orthodox world. Then thirdly, I'd like to provide some illustrative examples of the main operational spaces. Here I'll talk about the Church of Greece and Mount Athos and the soft and sharp powered tools that have been deployed for influence building and disruption. And then finally, by way of an incredibly synoptic conclusion, I'll offer a brief assessment of the impact of these influence building and disruption activities, and also say a word about where this kind of research fits into the scholarly research, particularly at the intersection of the social sciences and religious studies. So in terms of part 1, the background to the Greek case, as I mentioned, my research on Russian influence building and disruption in Greece was part of a CSIS project, and now the publication called Kremlin Playbook 3, Keeping the Faith, that's the subtitle. This was a project that involved a team of 6 scholar policymakers, and the Greece chapter is one of 4 cases: Greece, Bosnia-Herzegovina, France, and Georgia, in a study whose core questions were the following. First, are Russian malign influence operations in economics and politics, these were the issues extensively explored in the first 2 Kremlin playbooks, are those accompanied by similar influence building and disruption activities related to religion? So can we move from economics and politics to religion when it comes to influence building and disruption? Secondly, if so, what are the tactics, the strategies, the tools, and the context for those operations? Those were our 2 core questions, and our working hypotheses were as follows. First, that the Kremlin wants to influence people's beliefs, values, traditions, and practices, so that this will influence their political choices and behaviors, as well as their geostrategic orientations and geopolitical actions. Why? This influence building is requisite for Russia's great power aspirations since the Cold War, and especially under Vladimir Putin's tenure. And the war in Ukraine really throws all of this into tragic and sharp relief. The second hypothesis was that in order to accomplish their goals, Kremlin decision makers have instrumentalized religion, therefore necessitating a collaboration with the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate. Why? Because it has the capacity, the church that is, to operate transnationally. It has the capacity to influence beliefs, the nexus between theological interpretation and teachings and practices. And also the Moscow Patriarchate has the institutional, and here I would say ecclesiastical, context for building and multiplying influence and disruption. So where the earlier playbooks had analyzed and concluded that Russia's malign influence efforts across a whole series of country cases in Europe turned on a systematic, and this is a quote, opaque network of patronage that the Kremlin uses to influence and direct decision-making in order to weaken democratic systems from within by using existing and creating new societal divides. In our playbook, we hypothesized that the instrumentalization, and I would say the weaponization of religion, is a phenomenon that has equally important impacts in creating new societal divides, in aggravating existing divides, and in weakening democracy, and also an orientation towards transatlantic values and norms. Now, one of the interesting things about the playbook when we first began our research was that we hypothesized that the instrumentalization of religion was a relatively recent, albeit especially pernicious, development. My chapter on Greece, however, helps to uncover, I think, and elucidate the far deeper historical roots of the salience of religion as an influence-building tool, both for the Kremlin more recently, but for the Church of Russia in longer terms. And this underscores, I think, the importance of taking both classical and critical geopolitical approaches seriously when we think about Russia's objectives in Europe and Eurasia. And it also underscores the importance of taking history seriously by social scientists and certainly by policymakers. So let me, with that introduction, turn to part 2 of my presentation, namely Greece and why Greece holds particular significance for Russian influence building and disruption. And again, I want to highlight that when I talk about Russian, that's a placeholder for both Kremlin and Moscow Patriarchate. And I want us to keep in mind influence building as well as disruption. And finally, in NATO and in the Orthodox world. So why is Greece so significant? Greece, I would argue, is a crucial geospace for Russian geostrategic ambitions in the 21st century because of the country's intersection of both territorial and cultural geographies that are crucial to Russia's geostrategic goals. Russian foreign and security policy has gone through cycles of recalibration in the 3 decades since the end of the bipolar world order. But Russian decision makers have moved steadily from a focus on former imperial borderlands and near abroad to a global strategy that positions Russia as a great power, warranting international respect because of Moscow's capacity to affect geopolitics in Europe, Eurasia, and beyond. And indeed, a constant throughout the past 3 decades, but even before that, throughout the Cold War and over the long durée of pre-Westphalian imperial history, a constant has been Russia's unwavering focus on maximizing relations with Greece. Now, the significance of Greece as a target for Russian influence accrual is based on twofold and mutually reinforcing factors. Specifically, there's the focus on the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, on the Transatlantic Alliance, NATO, and there's also the focus on global Orthodox Christianity. So Greece is a key target because of its role in both the Transatlantic Alliance and within the global Orthodox ecosystem. And therefore, Moscow has viewed the instrumentalization and weaponization of traditionalism in the playbook, in the Kremlin playbook, the term strategic conservatism is used, but traditionalism or conservatism, and specifically Orthodox Christianity, as I would call a geometric influence builder or a multiplier, a geometric multiplier with regional, international, and transnational impacts. So Greece is at that intersection of regional, international, and transnational impacts. Now, both the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church understand religion as an invaluable equity in building influence within Greece and for using Greece for respective state and church geopolitical objectives. For the Russian state, Orthodoxy offers a channel for disruption inside NATO. And for the Russian church, Greece and orthodoxy in Greece, it offers an instrument for displacing the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople as the leader of the world's estimated 300 million Orthodox Christians, 250 to 300 million. It's tough to get a fully accurate number. But for displacing the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople as the primary interlocutor for global Orthodox Christianity, both in international religious and secular multilateral fora. Consequently, the Church of Greece and Mount Athos have become the 2 primary operational spaces in which Russia is deploying religion for influence building and disruption through a combination of soft and sharp power tools. For these combined and complementary state and religious geopolitical ambitions. Now, the Church of Greece is a norms entrepreneur. It's also crucial for its historical role in terms of the establishment of the Greek state. The Church of Greece then is viewed as a stakeholder in political conversations related to Greek sovereignty and to the country's place within the architecture of NATO, both as a collective defense alliance and as an alliance of Western values. Mount Athos, or the Holy Mountain, has been the undisputed center of Orthodox Christian spirituality since the 10th century establishment of the monastic community under Byzantine imperial patronage. And the self-governing legal personality of the monastic Republic of Mount Athos is recognized in both the Greek constitution and in European Union law. And while part of Greek sovereign territory, the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople has ecclesiastical jurisdiction over Mount Athos. And Mount Athos is comprised of 20 monasteries with approximately 2,000 monks, all affiliated with the world's Orthodox Christian churches, the Patriarchate's Autocephalous churches. So influence operations inside the Church of Greece and on Mount Athos are consequential for both Kremlin and Moscow Patriarchate respective geopolitical ambitions. Again, to weaken NATO internally and to weaken the legitimacy and role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate transnationally. Now, it's worth mentioning that experts disagree about the degree to which the Russian state and the Moscow Patriarchate work collaboratively and as equal partners in international influence building, and in the Greek case. The formulation of Caesaropapism, however, is both inaccurate and simplistic as a description of what is a complex, evolving church-state relationship, especially in the post-bipolar world. Although the Russian state was undoubtedly the arbiter of this relationship in the early stages of the post-Cold War period, largely due to the paucity of material assets at the disposal of the Church of Russia, which had been devastated by the effects of systematic and egregious persecution by the Soviet regime, or penetration as well by the Soviet regime. Empirical evidence and interviews suggest an evolution in the church-state balance of power in Russia. Wealth accumulation has enabled the Moscow Patriarchate to accrue increasing autonomy and leverage vis-a-vis the political regime over the past 2 decades, with the current moment in the church-state relationship really defined by the codependency and the pragmatic transactionalism between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Moscow Patriarch, Russian Patriarch Kirill. The former, of course, coming to power in 1999 and the latter enthroned in 2009. Indeed, the semiotics of Putin's widely mediatized visits to Mount Athos in 2005 and 2016, and I'll come back to those in the next part of my presentation. Those 2 mediatized visits were quite instructive. Russian and international media photos showed Patriarch Kirill featured prominently by Putin's side. And so we do see this relationship as the fulcrum for the broader institutional relationship between the state, the Kremlin, and the Moscow Patriarchate. But the degree to which the current church-state arrangement depends on these personalities remains a matter of academic policy and religious debate. But what's clear is that the Putin-Kirill relationship has been defined by a pragmatic calculus whereby cooperation is seen as mutually beneficial for the influence building operations and disruption operations of both state and church. It's also clear that within the rubric of religious diplomacy, Putin and Kirill have shown an agility and sometimes a sophistication, other times a primitiveness in their appreciation for orthodoxy as a multidimensional tool that transcends the territorialized boundaries of states. And as is the case with charismatic leaders working in authoritarian systems, the results of the Russian church-state relationship will certainly outlast these 2 foundational personalities, both as tools of domestic nationalism and as tools of foreign policy influence building. Now, I would also say, to conclude this first part here, it's important to recognize that history matters for making sense of why both Putin and Kirill share an understanding of Greece as a critical target for deploying influence building and disruption for their geopolitical goals. Moscow's concept of the Third Rome, the Moscow Patriarchate concept of the Third Rome, informed by pretensions of theological and ecclesiastical hegemony and geopolitical imperialism, has become the main justification for the Patriarchate of Moscow's use of cultural links and programs, ecclesiastical activities, and networks of cooperation and penetration, and media propaganda and misinformation directed towards and disseminated within Greece's religious field. So the Third Rome concept is especially important to disseminate within Greece's religious field. And despite its somewhat obscure iconography, in terms of the exact origins of the concept of the Third Rome, there is consensus that between the late 15th and mid 16th century, this messianic concept with religious and geopolitical implications was consolidated, and it was rediscovered under the Putin regime and by his Eurasianist geopolitical thinkers. Accordingly, the Patriarchate of Moscow declares itself the inheritor of the Constantinopolitan Byzantine imperial legacy. And this conceptual repackaging and twisting, deviation, I would say, of the Byzantine formulation of Constantinople as the new Rome to the Muscovite formulation of Constantinople as the second Rome, and then thereby positioning Moscow as the third Rome, makes Moscow and the Moscow Patriarchate the inheritor of and the protector of Orthodox Christian imperialism. And this has been fused with a pan-Slavic cultural identity that works sometimes with the dominance of Hellenism and at times seeks to supplant it. Now, accordingly, for the Moscow Patriarchate, the Third Rome entitles Russia to supplant and supersede the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, both in its primacy of honor and in its leadership role in the Orthodox world. And this helps us to understand the importance of the Church of Greece as a space for disseminating this idea of the Third Rome, and also of Mount Athos as a space, again, for disseminating the idea of the Third Rome and positioning the Moscow Patriarchate, not the Ecumenical Patriarchate, as the protector of orthodoxy and the fusion of orthodoxy and Hellenism. And the Russian argument goes that Constantinople fell into captivity in the 15th century, and that captivity has continued to the present, first under the Ottoman yoke and now under the Turkish state yoke. And so in order to protect the religious and cultural inheritance and the authenticity of Orthodox theology, which has been tarnished by, again, these are Russia's arguments, the Moscow Patriarchate's arguments, which that authenticity has been tarnished by Constantinople's dangerous modernism, expressed in ecumenical dialogue and activities, expressed in the commitment to restoration of full Eucharistic communion with Rome, and expressed in the support for universal human rights. The Moscow Patriarchate therefore must become the unrivaled leader of global orthodoxy. And the Church of Greece and Mount Athos as a pan-Orthodox space become absolutely crucial to persuading and or to coercing, persuading through soft power, coercing through sharp power of this position. Now, the Moscow Patriarchate's Third Rome pretensions have dovetailed perfectly with the Kremlin's Ruski Mir, or Russian world, nationalism and foreign policy revisionism. This, of course, turns on ethno-linguistic claims of the unity of all Russian speakers and Slavs baptized in the crucible of Kievan Rus in the 10th century. And this includes contemporary Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And again, the war in Ukraine throws a lot of this into very sharp and tragic relief, but it represents the crystallization of these complementary concepts of the Third Rome and the Russian world. And we can return to this in the discussion, the Q&A, but it appears that in both regards, Putin's war of aggression may be the death knell of both of these concepts. But again, we can return to this. But therefore, Greece and Mount Athos, the Church of Greece and Mount Athos, the overall Greek geospace become important and really almost a critical case study for geopolitical influence building, whether understood in territorial terms or whether understood in identity and cultural terms. So let me turn now to the third part of my presentation and give some very brief illustrative examples of the context and the tools by which Russian influence building and disruption have been deployed vis-a-vis the Church of Greece and Mount Athos, and keeping in mind, of course, the transnational links of both to the Ecumenical Patriarchate and to NATO. So these parallel and intersecting linkages. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Patriarchate and the state, the Moscow Patriarchate and the state, they've used both soft and sharp power tools as mechanisms for influence building and disruption. And soft power is certainly a concept that has in many ways been mainstreamed outside of its origins in political science and international relations theory and practice. But soft power is a concept that many may be familiar with, originated with political scientist Joseph Nye at Harvard's Kennedy School. And the idea of soft power stands in contrast to hard power. Hard power is coercive power through force and through material assets, usually through force, but also through economic assets. Soft power is understood as persuasive power, and it's based on the idea of using different assets to persuade others to be like you. And in the case of Mount Athos and the Church of Greece, and more broadly Greek society, the Moscow Patriarchate's goal is to persuade religious elites, social and political elites, and their communicants and citizens to be like Russia. In other words, to accept the authenticity of Russian religious interpretations about what is authentic orthodoxy. And by extension, the broader set of social and political values, commitments to human rights that are part of Orthodox authenticity. But the concept of soft power oftentimes fails to capture what happens when autocrats reach abroad. So in this case, Russian influence building has augmented soft power with what is a newer concept, that of sharp power. And sharp power seeks to impair free expression, to compromise and neutralize independent institutions, and to distort the political environment by using the media and technology domains. And we see that authoritarians around the world have invested, not only authoritarians, but also democratic regimes, but here we'll focus on what authoritarian regimes do. They have invested massive resources to attain a leading position in global markets, to change how people think, and to change how people think about and perceive facts, and to engage with technology in order to discover multiple truths, competing truths, and competing facts. And so the use of technology, particularly digital and other media technologies that are sharp because, quote, they pierce, penetrate, or perforate the information environments of countries, this has been central to the Kremlin's influence building in Greece. And it's also been important for the Moscow Patriarchate and its own influence building in terms of the Greek religious ecosystem. So let me say a little bit now in terms of some brief examples that illustrate the combination of soft and sharp power for influence building and disruption. And let us also keep in mind that time horizons matter, because when we think about influence building, and this has been very critical to the approach of both the Kremlin and the Moscow Patriarchate, influence building is understood in terms of short-term outcomes, but also in terms of a long-term time horizon. And in the short term, there's both influence and disruptive effects. And in the long term, in terms of a long-term time horizon, that's where we see the real shifts in influence building. So let me give some examples. The first one that may not be so obvious, but I think is remarkably illustrative of the point, involves the approach of the Moscow Patriarchate to what was the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church. That was convened by Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew in Greece, on Crete, in 2016. And here we see the use of both digital platforms to influence theological arguments, to shape the environment about whether or not the Holy and Great Council was holy and great, and whether it was legitimate, to influence also the ecclesiastical factions within the Church of Greece and in Greek society, who in those factions, who were part of the delegation to the Holy and Great Council. But above all, the goal of the Moscow Patriarchate was to undermine the legitimacy of the Ecumenical Patriarchate's primacy of honor and prerogatives of action as a leader of worldwide Orthodox Christianity. And Greece was literally the territorial space, but also the symbolic space for this approach by the Moscow Patriarchate. And I'll say just a couple of things here about the council. And I was actually present at the council. I was on the official delegation as a consultant, as part of the consultants of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And so I witnessed these things up close at the council. Now, what on the face of it might be seen as, a very specialized event that, for some focused on Orthodox theological arcana, is more accurately understood in terms of perhaps the analog being the Second Vatican Council for the Roman Catholic Church. Because by convening the 14 mutually recognized churches that constitute the 300 million Eastern Orthodox Christian communion worldwide, the Holy and Great Council was intended to do two things, and this is crucial: to promote theological unity, Orthodox unity, institutional ecclesiastical unity and vitality, and therefore also to enable the Eastern Orthodox churches to participate as one, as a unified whole, in concrete progress in ecumenical dialogue and action. And if we go back to the first part of the 20th century, when then Patriarch Joachim called for a Holy and Great Council, and if we read, the practicum of the Orthodox Church and the Ecumenical Patriarchate churches and Patriarchate at the time, we see that that Orthodox unity and ecumenism, or ecumenical reconciliation, are two sides of the same coin. And I mention that because these strike at the heart of the Moscow Patriarchate's claims for primacy, to determine unity, to lead unity, but also to reject ecumenism. And they have rejected ecumenism as a kind of dangerous modernism and deviation. So what did the Moscow Patriarchate do? And again, there's a longer story here, but I'll give you some key data points, which I think are very helpful. First of all, the council was originally scheduled to plan to occur in Turkey, in one of the ancient churches of the 7 ecumenical councils. The Moscow Patriarchate specifically asked for a change of venue, citing Turkey's shooting down of a Russian plane in 2015, and arguing that the Moscow Patriarchate's delegation would feel that their security, their physical security, might be at risk if the council were held in Turkey. Research will show, but I would hypothesize that this was also a moment of opportunity for the Moscow Patriarchate to press for the relocation of the council to Crete, where the soft and sharp power activities could be more effectively deployed. The Ecumenical Patriarchate because of their desire to ensure that the Moscow Patriarchate attended the council, agreed to relocate. And so Greece becomes very important, and Crete in particular, for the influence operations within the context of the Council of the Moscow Patriarchate. So not only the Church of Greece delegation that attended the Holy and Great Council, but also the Church of Greece as, the local host for the council, the Church of Crete, the Autonomous Church of Crete, as the local host, as it were, for the council. Now, interestingly enough, the Moscow Patriarchate actually played the role of spoiler, and at the 11th hour boycotted the council. And they boycotted and used their own leverage over 3 other patriarchates, Georgia, Bulgaria, and Antioch, to also boycott the council. And they used sharp power tools, digital media, to create almost a digital media flood or firestorm, depending on your preferred metaphor, to declare the council as illegitimate before it even occurred. And you can imagine that the epicenter of that digital media dissemination and use of platforms was Greece, both locally in Crete, but nationally across Crete. And they claimed that the council was illegitimate by virtue of the absence of 4 churches. And they also ensured another goal. There would be no discussion of the question of autocephaly of the church in Ukraine, and I'll come to that in a moment. But here we see, and again, we can do a deeper dive into the details here, but we see both in the pressure to relocate or the request to relocate to the Greek space through the use of digital disinformation, misinformation, and a steady stream of arguments about the council as illegitimate. Therefore, consequently, the Ecumenical Patriarch's claims that this was a holy and great council should be rejected. The Moscow Patriarchate was able to use both soft and sharp power tools to try to persuade and to coerce when it comes to its influence in the Greek religious ecosystem. It's also important, I think, to just as a footnote here, to point out that one of the most tested conversations and sets of deliberations at the council was the issue of what to call churches, and a dispute about whether or not other churches, Roman Catholic and Protestant, are indeed churches. And again, the Moscow Patriarch's claims is that both the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Church are deviant at best, and some would call them in the Moscow Patriarchate heretical at worst. And we saw, and therefore ecumenism is a dangerous enterprise that threatens to dilute and pervert what is authentic orthodoxy. And we saw this message being disseminated and replicated through leaks from the council. And it's not that the council was closed, but that messaging, that we saw in the debates within the council was amplified and disseminated throughout the Greek religious ecosystem, but also globally. That's the first event I would identify. The second event I would identify has been the Moscow Patriarchate's reaction to the decision of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in January of 2019 to grant a tomos of autocephaly, a tomos of self-governance to what is now the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And again, the question of autocephaly in general was on the agenda at the Holy and Great Council, but the absence of those 4 churches was one of the reasons that the specific question of Ukrainian autocephaly was not part of the agenda. So here we see again absence, which is an interesting approach, absence as much as presence being utilized again to disseminate a particular perspective, in this case, Moscow's perspective that the Ecumenical Patriarchate does not have the authority to grant autocephaly. We see it beginning at the Holy and Great Council and being amplified as a reaction then to the decision in January of 2019. And here again, I was present at the Phanar, at the Ecumenical Patriarchate, for the liturgy and the signing of the Tomos of Autocephaly. And it was interesting to hear the conversations amongst those in attendance about that decision. But why does Ukrainian autocephaly matter for the Greek ecosystem? It matters because, in particular, the Moscow Patriarchate has claimed that the decision on autocephaly has been illegitimate, and through the use of sharp power tools, a whole host of social media sites and other platforms, many of them on Mount Athos, in fact, the message has been disseminated that the Ecumenical Patriarchate is sowing disunity in global orthodoxy. There have been also other tools of leverage, economic and financial incentives in particular, that the Moscow Patriarchate has utilized vis-a-vis targeted actors in the Church of Greece and on Mount Athos to try to persuade the Church of Greece not to recognize the decision on autocephaly. Indeed, the Church of Greece did recognize the autocephaly decision, but the fear inside the Church of Greece, amongst many Church of Greece actors, was that recognition might produce punitive action by Moscow. And indeed, that fear seems to have been driven home by the reaction of the Moscow Patriarchate to the Patriarchate of Alexandria's decision to recognize autocephaly, when in December of 2021, the Moscow Patriarchate, the Synod declared that they were establishing an exarchate in Africa, and they were very clear that they were establishing that exarchate there because of the Patriarchate of Alexandria's recognition of what they call an illegitimate decision following what Moscow has claimed is the schismatic action, that's Moscow's language, of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So a punitive reaction seen as competition and disintegration of a unified ecclesial space in Africa, which has been read back in the Greek religious ecosystem as a potential step to the establishment of a Moscow Russian exarchate in Greece and also potentially in Turkey. And again, we can come back to more of these details. All of this has been disseminated through digital systems and also reinforced by the use of economic and financial leverage targeting individuals in the Church of Greece. And now we'll get to on Mount Athos as well. The third example, Mount Athos, because I think I have about 2 minutes left, and I might go over a couple minutes, but I'll try to be brief. Influence building and disruption activities on Mount Athos. Mount Athos is understood as a geometric force multiplier for Kremlin and Moscow Patriarchate influence building activities. Mount Athos, because it's a pan-Orthodox space, it's also seen as a norms entrepreneur that generates what is understood to be authentic orthodoxy and positions on traditional orthodoxy, traditional values. And so the importance of Mount Athos as a space of activity for the Kremlin and the Patriarchate, I think, is best illustrated in the 2 visits, as I mentioned earlier on, by Putin, high-profile visits accompanied by Patriarch Kirill to Mount Athos. Mount Athos is interesting because it's at least at present, a male-only monastic space that is a closed ecosystem that makes the dissemination of information, disinformation, and misinformation that can be carefully curated and recycled all the easier because of the closed space on the mountain, but also then disseminated beyond the mountain through digital connectivity and interpersonal connections. Mount Athos is also very important as an influence building space because of the pilgrims from the global Orthodox community who pass through or visit the Holy Mountain. And so again, dissemination, curation and dissemination of information about the deviant ecumenism and modernism of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, of those in the Church of Greece who commit to ecumenical activity and ecumenical objectives is targeted in Mount Athos. And the deviations then of ecumenism and modernism become crystallized and replicated and sent out through the echo chamber and from the echo chamber of Mount Athos, which again has a glocal character, locally inside Greece and Greek territory, and globally as part of the Orthodox world. And again, we can come back to more details, but I think it's important to recognize that in terms of the two visits of Putin and Kirill together to Mount Athos, there's a kind of cognitive cultural framework at work where those pilgrimages amounted to performative sanctification of Russian state nationalism, Ruski Mir, and also the Third Rome philosophy concept promoted by the Moscow Patriarchate. And the images and semiotics of the two visits were very powerful. Putin and Kirill pictured side by side, trading on Kirill's characterization of Putin as a miracle of God. It's also interesting that those two visits were disseminated all over Greece, of course, but around the Orthodox world, and then of course globally in the secular world. There are a whole host of media sites that oftentimes receive direct and indirect funding from the Kremlin and from also the Moscow Patriarchate. And there are key monastic spaces, we can talk about those, that have been targeted. Now, I'll sum up here. What does all of this mean, and what conclusions can we take away? In terms of in terms of the academic space and scholarship, I think we need to pay attention to both classical and critical approaches, territorial and symbolic identity approaches to geography. We need to think about geographies and their plural forms and the implications, therefore, of those plural geographies on politics and influence building. Secondly, we need to take seriously the intersection of religion and international relations in the modern world, but we also need to think historically. Thirdly, we need to think about time horizons, think about influence building in the short term and disruption in the short term, but influence building in the long term. We also need to understand the tools by which influence building and disruption occur through both soft and sharp power, and also hard power, or in the words of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, through the combined uses of hard, soft, and sharp power as smart power. And finally, in terms of the specificity of Greece, Greece's location within the transatlantic alliance, again, a collective security alliance, but also an alliance, at least as the NATO charter tells us, a putative alliance of universal values and democratic values. Greece becomes critical as a target of influence building operations, but also because of the specificity of Greece and its relationship to the Ecumenical Patriarchate as an influence building space for changes in the perspectives, the theologies, and the practices of global orthodoxy. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. This was such a great and rich presentation. I have so many questions, but I will remain last of the last because we want to hear Nikos first. And then already questions are piling up in the Q&A. So to the audience following the talk, please post them in the Q&A section, not in the chat section, because I'll probably miss them if you post them in the chat. So Nico, you have the floor. And
thank you very much. Thank you to the program. Thank you to Yorgos for inviting me, and thank you to Elizabeth for such great sort of overview and a kind of talk that makes one consider quite a few assumptions, maybe. What I'm going to do myself is I'm going to first talk about a few points that I think are important after this talk, and then I'm going to sort of pose some questions, not necessarily to Elizabeth only, but maybe they will come up in other people's remarks as well. I think it's very clear that religion is about power, first and foremost from this talk. So as a historian, it is interesting for me to see how a political scientist approaches themes and topics that I have also grappled with in my work and in the work of other historians. So based on my own kind of presumed expertise, whatever that may mean, in terms of Orthodoxy and Greek-Russian relations, I think several sort of themes or points stood out for me. I think it is very clear from Elizabeth's talk that beyond Orthodoxy's present, there is a past that weighs very heavily on the present. And I wanted to emphasize here that this past, for about 1800 years, depending on when you start counting the life of Orthodoxy, has been imperial. It's an imperial past. It's only in the last couple of hundred years that we're actually dealing with national settings for Orthodox. Now, this is, in my mind, important because in some ways, in the case of Russia, you see this kind of what I call the acrobatics, calisthenics, and gymnastics of playing the nations versus the empire. And what I mean by that, in essence, is that in my kind of mind, at least, Orthodoxy is still sort of, when you sit down, for example, and you talk about church-state relations in Orthodox cultures, in Orthodox countries, inevitably, the idea that comes up is symphonia, which is a 6th century concept right from Byzantium. It's as if for 1400 years, we haven't done anything else other than agree with one another, or between an emperor and a patriarch, between church and state. Now, I'm not gonna discuss here myself whether this is sort of the way it should be, if it's a helpful concept. I'm just gonna say that to my mind, because Orthodoxy never went through a reformation, it never really seriously thought about church-state relations beyond the concept of symphonia. And I know that quite a few people are going to think that I'm being overly generalizing here, but I think it's important for us to think a little bit about the comparative experience of other Christian denominations in this respect, church-state relations. That's why it seems to me, even in the case of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, for example, there is a lot of this acrobatics and the gymnastics and the calisthenics of what it is all about. One year it's multi-confessional, the next year it's culturally Russian. One year it's Rossiyski, which means the sort of general, all-inclusive, sort of civic, if you wish, kind of inclusive category for Russian. In other cases, it's Ruski, which is more kind of narrow, shall we say. In some cases, it includes the Tatars who are Muslims. In other cases, it does not. So it seems to me, therefore, that because the Russian church-state relations, because of Orthodoxy, have not been figured out, shall we say, at the time of the fall of empires and the creation of national states, or a-confessional states, atheistic states, and then their fall. Because of all this mess, it seems to me that what we really have is a kind of uncertainty, whether we are kind of codependent with the state, or we are dominated by the state. And here I have to say that in my mind, and quite a few of my colleagues disagree with me on that, in general, the state has, in the historical experience of Orthodoxy, dominated the church. So I'm a little bit less convinced myself, I believe, that there is this codependence there. In other words, what I'm saying myself simply is Kirill is not going to move unless the state allows him to. this is the kind of situation here. And I think this is very obvious in the sermons. It is very obvious even in the 4 days ago, they published in Russian the kind of charter for the creation of the Exarchate in Africa. If you sit down and you read the actual charter, it is purely a kind of state-stitched document with a sort of surface of religion on it. Really, it's very interesting. All right, now geography, Elizabeth told us, is very important, absolutely. And the geography of salvation is very important, right? Mount Athos, Jerusalem, you know, other monastic sort of places, centers, and so on. And I am wondering here if to what extent this kind of importance of Greece as such is in fact justified. And the reason I'm saying this is because there has been a love-hate relationship between Russians and Greeks, you know, for a long time, starting at least in the sort of 16th, 17th century. And you can see it, you know, all the way to today. The Russians still think that Greeks have corrupted Orthodoxy, and the Greeks still think that the Russians are simply sort of little children when it comes down to kind of leading sort of the charge in Orthodox theology. Again, I'm simplifying a little bit here, but it's quite interesting, for example, to see where Russian theology picked up after the fall of the Soviet Union. They picked up where they left back in 1917 in terms of topics, issues they covered, and so on. It's as if for 70 years, nothing happened there. And so, I don't know, it is, I think here it's Athos is more important than Greece itself, it seems to me. These are just some thoughts that I wanted to sort of put out there. I think that the talk touched upon a lot of other ones as well, but here are a few of the questions that I would like to sort of pose there. Having heard Elizabeth talk, what's the importance and the relationship between orthodoxy and democracy? Orthodox is not a very democratic Christian denomination, if you think about it, when it comes down to the way it approaches civic religion. I'm not talking about its own administration. So, to my mind, always. So, I'm sort of thinking here, if the Russians are out there, church and state together, according to Elizabeth, undermining democracy, what is Orthodoxy in Greece doing to counter that? That would be one of the questions that I would ask. I worry a little bit about the term authentic orthodoxy. And I know this is theological rather than historical, but quite frankly, if you listen to Orthodox theologians, they actually say that Orthodoxy has no history. It has remained the way it has been since patristic times. That is simply not true, as we know, but the authenticity part there is very shaky. So I'm sort of wondering whether we can actually see that as anything beyond kind of a weapon in the discourse that is going on. Finally, the soft power, hard power, sharp power tools. It's quite interesting to me because as I'm thinking about sharpness of weapons, I'm thinking, hey, it's not just authoritarian regimes that are basically using them. The CIA has had the same kind of tools across its history, right? And so I'm wondering myself, any kind of secret service, I'm wondering myself here, how do the recipients of these influences respond? And here I'm just going to give you the example of Mount Athos because recently I was actually reading about it. Interestingly to me, what Mount Athos has done, it has always had very close relations with power, number one. And number two, they always use one power against the other, both within individual monasteries, but also, in coalition against others. And so I'm sort of wondering here, therefore, the question is, okay, they got the money. Where did the money go? And what did they do with it? How did they counter it or not? I'm going to stop here because I told Yorgo I was going to talk for 10 minutes, and I think I spoke a little bit more. But thank you to Elizabeth for this very stimulating talk and for, in fact, taking orthodoxy seriously, because I am sort of wondering sometimes, especially in the last 6 weeks, quite a few commentators in English have come out and used the trope, oh, orthodoxy is not understood by the West. And I thought that we had gone way beyond that, but it looks like it's coming back. So we have to counter that. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Nico. Elizabeth, I want to give you the opportunity to respond if you want to, or answer or comment to anything that Nikos have said. Otherwise, I can go ahead and read some of the questions, but did you want to?
Can I just give 3 brief comments? And thank you, Nico, because I took copious notes, and now these are things that I would like to incorporate too. I think, the issue of sort of orthodoxy's past weighing heavily, and in some ways heavily on its present and future, that's indisputable. And I think what we're seeing in terms of, the discussion about Russian influence building, and in general, the sort of the competition by Moscow with Constantinople and et cetera, is this question of, past as important, but present and future as just as important, not to be captive to the past. And if you read debates amongst theologians, but also amongst others who, are not theologians like myself, political scientists and others, there's an effort, I think, to see the past as relevant, but not be captured by it, and argue against that. In terms of orthodoxy not going through a reformation, I certainly agree with that in, I guess I would say in, sort of precise terms of how we understand the Reformation. But I think that's where the Crete event is so important, because if we think of, the notion of kind of aggiornamento, Reformation as aggiornamento, Crete was, an opportunity for some of that to happen. I think the ambitions were constrained by the boycotting of 4, but nonetheless, I think, that's where we are beginning to see debates about history versus present and future play out, and also about the realization that the orthodoxy is indeed global. It's not simply a local or old world church, that it's a global church, and what that globality and global footprint means for unity and diversity, for the pluralism that exists across the various Orthodox churches, but within them as well. And even if we look at things as, specific as the social doctrine of the Orthodox Church produced by Moscow, and then the social concept of the Orthodox Church produced by Constantinople, there we see that that kind of pluralism on display. And I think there's sort of the indications of some sort of aggiornamento or reformation at work. And it may be that Ukraine becomes the violent crucible for a more kind of fulsome exploration of that pluralism and different approaches to theological interpretation, practice, and social and political responsibility. So I would just throw that out there. The second thing, Mount Athos. I think we cannot extract Mount Athos from Greece. Yes, it has its own particularity, territorial governance, et cetera, but it's inside Greece, and it's understood by all Orthodox churches. Part of its value is precisely that it's inside Greece. So that's the third thing. And then in terms of orthodoxy and democracy, that's a big conversation, but we can come back to what we mean by democracy. And then a footnote, I would say the orientalization of orthodoxy, the ongoing orientalization of orthodoxy, has been on full display in some of the conversations about, Kirill's, from my view, absolutely deplorable and indefensible support for the war. But be that as it may, the kind of language that we've seen deployed about orthodoxy, qua orthodoxy, speaks to, the worst, continuation of Orientalist tropes, and alas, the internalization of those tropes, and sometimes their deployment by Kirill, for example, and others for purposes of power. So again, a big topic, but I just, by way of initial response. So thank you so much.
Oh, this is so exciting. I do have questions, and I promised I will not ask, but I will just state one statement. It sounds from listening to both of you that, and I'm coming from the field of culture and literature mostly, but it does remind me a lot of Zosimo Lorenzato's essay in the middle of the 20th century, The Lost Center. This nostalgia of an Eastern Orthodox mysticism that he was proposing against the modernist ideas of Seferis, particularly. It also resonates with my own kind of biographical experience. My father, who was uneducated, would occasionally speak about the books mentioning a blonde nation coming down to liberate us. And he was particularly talking after the Turkish invasion of 74, right? But it just pressed the point of how much it still resonates. And I would guess that some of the reactions to the war in Ukraine also have their kind of emotional basis on this legacy that has gone down through the oral tradition as well. But I wanted to propose one maybe relationship because the articulation of Russian Orthodoxy as the third Rome sounds a lot like what the Western powers did with the classical tradition. It seems to me that Mount Athos has replaced Hagia Sophia as the emblem of Orthodoxy, and that Mount Athos is to Russia what the Parthenon is to the West. They're both in Greece. They must and should and will remain in Greece, but they don't belong to Greece only. So there's this question of ownership, not just of the artifacts themselves or the material culture of the monasteries, but the symbolic and even emotional resonance that they have. Even as the Parthenon is a pile of ruins, as the Archbishop here described it, and the mountain is inaccessible to the world, especially if you're female, I'm guessing, but it probably isn't as accessible to non-Orthodox as well, because there is a waiting line, I believe, right? You cannot just show up and go.
No, you cannot.
You need a permit. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead.
I just make a comment about the third Rome, Yorgo, because this is a theory that in my field, the early modern Russian history field, has been debunked totally. It never existed. It never guided any policy. It was just the music of a monk, and then it became a big topic in the 19th century when several scholars decided that it reflected the earlier period. So anything that has to do with Third Rome as being any guiding principle of the Russian church or the Russian state in the Russian field always I'm talking about is simply not accepted. So I'm not sure that we can use it as an analytical category or write books about that.
Yes.
At least if you guys take seriously what we have to say. But there is a certain messianism there. The messianism is there. It may not be the Third Rome kind of messianism necessarily. I just want
Nico, yes, I was not quoting it as a historical reality or a practice, but rather as a discourse.
As a discourse, absolutely.
Right, and I mean, you're mentioning it that it's an invention of the 19th century, and what I've been recently reading about German classicism and the way they understood the migration of Indo-European tribes into Greece. Their perception was that they were Indo-Germans who inhabited the Greek peninsula, and then created all these great civilizations in the East, including the Persians. All of these were sort of Germanic tribes according to that model, that then and this is where my interest was piqued, then became decadent and perverted the purity of the Germanic tribes in a very similar fashion that Greece is a perversion of orthodoxy for the Russians. So there is this rhetoric of purity, of perversion, and then the return of the pure Christian or the pure German in the case of the Nazis as they came down to Greece to reclaim their legacy. I mean, I think even though they're both debunked as theories, I think they operated very much in mobilizing not just the minds and imaginations, but even entire military operations in this case. So I want to go to the questions, and I'm going to be reading them as they show up on the list there. The first one is from Dimitrios Samaras, and Elizabeth and Nico, you can both see them in case I mispronounce anything, but here's the first one. I understand that the weaponization of religion in Greece and Eastern Europe functions through Mount Athos. In your opinion, who must tackle this operation? Greece alone? Greece and the EU? Greece and NATO? Only NATO? Leaving Greece aside if possible?
So I'll just give a brief answer. Yeah, that's one of the spaces, Mount Athos, and I tried to explain why Mount Athos is so important because of its local and global, impact. But in terms of tackling, I would say that it's just, first of all, it's important to be aware of it. I think it's very difficult to measure the impact of these influence building operations. First of all, it's very difficult to get people to talk about it, number one. So when you do the research, almost everything is off the record. And there's a hesitation to discuss this. And then there's the measurement question, the metric. How do we measure influence? And I think one of the ways that we measure influence is in terms of the social media sites. I mean, they measure themselves. They have all of the metrics that are used in terms of viewers or clicks or hits, where they come from, et cetera. So the frequency, but also we'll begin to see the influence in terms of the public discourse of Orthodox leaders on the mountain and those who are off the mountain. And then in terms of communicants who, support or follow particular interpretations. But who should tackle it? First of all, let's get NATO right off of that list. I mean, the notion that NATO, and here I would speak in an unfiltered fashion, the notion that NATO has any business intervening in the internal affairs of religious institutions, first of all, it's a violation of international law. International law, one, freedom of, from, for, in religion, means that states or certainly military alliances have no business interfering in the internal affairs of any religious tradition. And secondly, NATO has its own values crisis, I think, empirically measured, since we hear day after day about NATO as a community of values and Putin and Russia as the antithesis of that. I would submit that NATO has its own member that is exactly like Putin and Russia, and that is called Turkey. So it's not to mention the other members like Hungary or et cetera, or Poland, but in any event, so get NATO off the table. I think, we're talking about in many ways, an internal religious issue. And this is where the pluralism and the contestation and the importance of institutional processes and transparency for global orthodoxy to get their own house in order, whatever that may mean, is important. And then I think certainly for the Greek state, yes, recognizing from the Greek state that notwithstanding the specificity of Mount Athos's, autonomy, that Mount Athos is inside Greece, that it is a target of influence building, it's a target of malign activities, and those malign activities are specifically dedicated towards disrupting Greece's geopolitical influence and stature within NATO and Greece's own values as a democracy, then the Greek state, is important in this regard. But no NATO. So,
right.
Yeah.
Next one from Lauren Danforth. Could you please discuss further the issue of the autocephaly of the Ukrainian and the Macedonian Orthodox churches?
Okay, and again, I can discuss these as a political scientist, not as a theologian. First of all, in terms of the Macedonian Orthodox Church, I know little about it other than that there is a Serbian Orthodox Church, and I think we're now talking about the question of, whether or not there will be autonomy or autocephaly for the church in Northern Macedonia. So I cannot discuss that with any, expertise. In terms of Ukraine, what do we know about Ukraine? We know that the question of Ukrainian autocephaly far precedes the last few years, and far precedes even the granting of the Tomos in 2019. Since the end of the Cold War in particular, but even before that, there's a long history that relates to the shift in the Church of Russia from Kiev to Moscow, and there are reasons for that. But since the end of the Cold War, what has happened is that there was a request from the Ukrainian government and also from those in the church in Ukraine to the Ecumenical Patriarchate for a restoration of autocephaly for the church in Ukraine. That meant, by implication, two things. One, that the process was important, and here's the primacy of honor of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, going back to the Fourth Ecumenical Council and the 20th Canon, and other canons as well, where the Patriarchate has the authority to resolve disputes amongst local churches if they cannot resolve the dispute themselves. That's one thing. The second thing is the diversity in and the pluralism in the Orthodox ecosystem in Ukraine, with 3 competing Orthodox churches and now 2 since the granting of the Tomos. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine - Moscow Patriarchate, which belongs to the Patriarchate of Moscow, or is is affiliated with and constitutive part, and now this new autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine. The Moscow Patriarchate rejected the authority of Constantinople to resolve the dispute over autocephaly. Moscow did not come to Crete, which would have been an environment where there could have been progress on this issue. The Moscow Patriarchate has also declared the Ecumenical Patriarchate to be schismatic, which in any Christian tradition, and certainly in Orthodoxy, is a hugely laden term. It's a hard power term in many ways. And Moscow no longer commemorates the Ecumenical Patriarchate in liturgies and the diptychs. They have also taken retribution, as I mentioned, against any church, and in this case, the Patriarchate, Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria, for recognizing autocephaly. It's very possible, if not likely, that an exarchate could be established in Greece and in Russia, and perhaps other parts, Cyprus, maybe even Israel and Jerusalem. On the face of it, in terms of international law, there's nothing to prevent that happening. You can plant your pole anywhere you want, for a mosque, a church, a synagogue, anything you want, a temple. In ecclesial terms, again, this is seen as a direct blow to canonical and ecclesial unity. So I would predict, based on what's happening on the empirical evidence, that the events in Ukraine may lead to other churches paradoxically recognizing the autocephalous church in Ukraine. Although there's a fear of greater retribution, I think that the support of the Moscow Patriarchate for violence perpetrated by the Russian state against other Orthodox Christians is something that may be turning the tide and lead to greater recognition. There are all these other hints as well. For example, the Moscow Patriarchate Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the head of that church, Metropolitan Onufry, has critiqued and criticized the invasion in Ukraine. There have been several priests who have publicly stopped commemorating the Moscow Patriarchate in their liturgies, even though they belong still to the Moscow Patriarchate. So I think the war, in many ways, is going to sharpen this competition, this dispute, and in some ways, paradoxically, lead to other churches recognizing. Of course, the other thing that people wonder is whether or not it will exercise a chilling effect on recognition. I think it may lead slowly in the other direction to greater recognition.
Elizabeth, for those of us that are not familiar with the Orthodox tradition, can you just very briefly define autocephaly for us?
Oh, so
I haven't heard it in the Catholic or Protestant tradition, so it may need some elaboration.
Right. So self-governing, I guess we can say independent, but self-governing churches, churches which, have their own hierarchical institutional structure. They, conform to the theology and the doctrine of the seven ecumenical councils, first seven ecumenical councils, but they are self-governing. So they elect their own hierarchs, et cetera, and they function independently.
Is it true? I mean, I know of the Cypriot one because I'm from there, but is it true that do all of them have a degree of a popular vote for the election of the archbishop? There is such a system in the Cypriot case where the faithful get to vote as well.
Okay, Nico can be better positioned to answer that, but the simple answer is no.
Yes.
And alas, that fullness of the ecclesial body and participating in the election of hierarchs has been something that's lost over time, and that's why Crete again was interesting, because although in a kind of constrained way, the inclusion of hierarchs, laity, clergy, men and women was, gender inclusiveness was also very interesting, and some would say a hopeful sign of the recovering of, the early church tradition of participation. But Nico, you can, answer this probably far more expertly than I.
Very quickly, the Cypriots are a special case. They've gotten their autocephaly since ancient times, and therefore you guys have had it there. You have a long history of it. Autocephaly is always messy. It is never non-messy. It is always a deeply political act. In other words, it sort of becomes an issue because politics changes. And number three, autocephaly always involves kind of wait and see until you get the legitimacy. The Greeks got their own church precisely in the same way. Then the Bulgarians did. And then everybody else followed. The Ukrainians are actually getting it now because they also got their own state. It took about 20 years to convince the Patriarchate to do it, but they did eventually do that. I'm just going to stop at that, though.
Yes. Well, in any case, the elections of the Archbishop of Cyprus, the current one, were mired in controversy because apparently he got the least votes, but got the archbishop seat anyway. So the next question actually comes from the chat function here. So I'm not going to go in sequence in the Q&A because there was another question in the chat about Cyprus, I guess. This comes from Brory Harbo. Could you also speak about Russian influence in Cyprus as well? They're ethnically Greek, or most of them are, or, yes. So this is for you, Elizabeth. Anything you have to say about Cyprus and the influence of the Russian church there?
Sure. I mean, again, I think the Russian church, let me start by saying, Nico, your comment at the beginning about sort of religion is about power. I think, what the influence building of the Moscow Patriarchate in particular shows, but I guess we could generalize this, is that, we're seeing churches behave like states, because the issue of territorialization or transnationalism, trans-territory, this is, at the heart of some of what we're talking about in terms of influence building. Now, and going to the Cyprus case, the Moscow Patriarchate has a European, Eurasian, and I would say a global strategy when it comes to influence building. And in that regard, recognizes the globality of the Orthodox Church. And it also sees the ecumenical, position of the Patriarchate of Constantinople as a global position, and therefore as one to be competed against. And so individual churches become very important in terms of influence building in favor of Moscow and in opposition to Constantinople. And again, taking us back to this question of theological interpretation. We can say fundamentalism, traditionalism, and modernism. We can attach different terms to those, but those three competing trajectories, which by the way are not unique to Orthodoxy by any means. In this regard, we're seeing Orthodoxy converge with pretty much every other faith tradition in the world, and certainly with Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. In the case of the Church of Cyprus, geopolitically important in terms of territory, Eastern Mediterranean, intersection of three main continents, projection of hard and soft power onto three continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa. So, Russia becomes Cyprus becomes very important in that regard. And again, the Church of Cyprus as a norms protagonist, as a norms entrepreneur, in shaping popular social values and in shaping perceptions about where Cyprus fits in terms of the geopolitics of NATO or not NATO, the EU or alternatives, makes the Church of Cyprus very, very important for Russia's Kremlin and Moscow Patriarchate influence building. Cyprus has also been, and we know this certainly from its membership in the EU and the convergence with the acquis, in terms of its financial transparency and accountability, has been a space where a lot of money laundering and black market economic activities have occurred. How does that connect to the church, to the Moscow Patriarchate, and the so-called Orthodox oligarchs who have well understood foreign direct investment, investment in local economies, both transparent and non-transparent, as a critical mechanism for building Russian influence, both church and state influence. And again, we see that in the case of Cyprus. Here again, it's very difficult to gather data. A lot of this is anecdotal, and it will rely on, I hope, whether I would love to be able to do more field research, but someone must be doing dissertations on these issues, looking at particular case study in the Church of Cyprus, because it has been a target for Russian influence building as part of the broader geopolitical influence.
We need to include an economist or a financial analyst in this conversation, because the question of economics is also a factor here. And I'm speaking specifically of maybe a soft power tool, which is religious tourism.
Yes, yes.
Right? Religious tourism, which is the beginning of or let's say an infiltration, but then later on the acquisition of assets and the extent to which these assets were linked or not to the church. I don't know the history of the Russian church and how much property still retains after the Soviet period, but it is a factor in its relationship with the Cypriot church. There's also a connection here with the war in Libya, by the way, that happened when the Russians were negotiating rights for the Russian Navy to dock in Cyprus, which fell apart after the basically the looting of the Cypriot banks and the Russian deposits there. So I'm going to go to the next question. This is by Luke Jeske. Actually, Luke has 3 questions, so one of which we have already answered. So I will pose the first one here, which is who are or who were the Russian social media campaigns targeting? Were Greek clergy or lay persons interacting with these efforts, or were the consumers of these campaigns mostly for Russian audiences?
Okay, so I'll come back to the other thing. Okay, the Cyprus thing. No, the audiences are definitely not primarily Russian audiences. The audiences are Greek in terms of monothos, the Greek space, number one. but also the global Orthodox space, number 2. And so, social media platforms, and there are a whole host of them. I mean, I could go down the list, but you can see the playbook on the CSIS website, and you can go to the Greek chapter and you'll see some of the, the media and social media platforms, and also the intersection of social media, conventional media, and other investments, again, by Russian, Orthodox oligarchs. For example, in sports teams, in the tourism industry writ large, hotels, etc., and how these all intersect for disseminating and projecting certain kind of messages. But so simple answer, not primarily Russian audience, primarily Greek and other audiences, number 1. And number 2, particular monasteries that are seen as invaluable for the Russian messaging, because of the sheer volume of tourists who go through, religious tourists or pilgrims who go through from Greece, number 1, or from, around the world, number 2. And some of those, and again, I've mentioned those in the playbook. Some of those also have their own social media platform. So there's a recognition that the volume of pilgrims and the readers and listeners and viewers on these websites are Greece, number 1, and Greek speaking, number 2. So there we go to Greece, Cyprus, the Patriarchate of Alexandria, the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Those are number 1. And number 2, the pilgrims from around the world, from all of the different Orthodox churches. So there's a quite sophisticated as well English language set of platforms for those viewers, listeners, and readers. And that is, again, for Greece, but it's for globally. So it's largely non-Russian.
Mm. Okay.
I would urge you just to go to the chapter, and you can see the key monasteries and also the key platforms. It's also worth pointing out that in terms of, just to go back to this economic dimension of this soft sharp power matrix, it's worth pointing out that in terms of religious tourism, not only the income that comes to local churches from religious tourists, but it's the whole matrix associated with religious tourism. So it's the hotels, it's the the shopping and local economies, etc. And we have seen also that in the case of the establishment of the Exarchate in Africa, that one of the things that preceded the establishment of the Russian Exarchate in Africa was direct orders to Russian priests and pilgrims and tourist groups that would go to churches in Africa that belonged to the Patriarchate of Alexandria, not to go to those churches after the recognition of autocephaly, the Ukrainian autocephaly, depriving them then of, in this case, in the African context, invaluable resources, material resources in the largely impoverished environment.
Mm. Okay, the last question actually converges with the third question that Luke Jeske posed, so I'm going to read them both together. Luke Jeske asks, how do you view the soft and hard power Greece exerts in the Orthodox world? Is it a competitor to Russia, a counterweight, or something else? And then the anonymous question at the end, kind of on the similar lines, is, does the Moscow Patriarchate have any influence on the election of the new ecumenical patriarch? So it's, how do Greece and Russia converge or compete for control of the Patriarchate in Constantinople, in Istanbul? So does Greece have a similar, does the Church of Greece have a similar ambition or plans or an agenda? I know there's been kind of, at least in the case of Cyprus, the dissent from Vatopedi was controversial at the time, and I wasn't aware of why there was this sort of split, but apparently it might have to do with this new kind of regime in Mount Athos that is infiltrating the local churches as well now. So where does the Church of Greece belong in this relationship?
Okay, so, and I was also reading the earlier question too, somewhat related.
Yes.
So I think, because it also included the ecumenical patriarchate and soft power. I think, the soft power of the ecumenical patriarchate is multifaceted. First of all, in terms of its, ongoing, position as the first among equals, and having this primacy of honor. Moscow, of course, has questioned this openly. Within the different Orthodox churches, I think there have been some, well, we know that there have been some, and we see it on all the media sites and also in the literature. There have been some that have questioned not necessarily the primacy of honor and the prerogatives of the primacy of honor, but the capacity of the ecumenical patriarchate to carry out its responsibilities. And here I would say, here's where the other kind of geopolitics becomes critical, because the ecumenical patriarchate lives in an environment and in a state that has been actively dedicated to its annihilation and to the annihilation of what's left of the Greek Orthodox community inside Turkey. And that's not hyperbole. I mean, I could spend the next 6 hours if we had them, giving you empirical evidence towards that. So the ecumenical patriarchate lives in very hostile conditions. However, having said that, that I would say that has not, hindered the capacity or the will of the patriarchate to engage as a global actor. And I think precisely because in terms of international relations and geopolitics, there is a recognition, certainly in European and the American and the transatlantic context, of the conditions under which Constantinople labors, the willingness of the ecumenical patriarchate to speak consistently and I would say bravely and theologically correctly in favor of universal human rights, in favor of international law, at the risk of physical security to the patriarchate and the community. That has actually paradoxically increased the soft power of the ecumenical patriarchate in international human rights contexts, in multilateral settings where human rights are and international law are valued, for example, in the European Union, in the OSCE, in other contexts, and also in terms of the ecumenical movement. Now, having said all of that, then we go to the Church of Greece. I think the Church of Greece has been more reticent and less active in thinking about its own soft power tools. And in this particular case, I think that derives from two things. Number one, the specificity of the Greek religious ecosystem, because there is the Church of Greece, there is Mount Athos. The Church of Greece includes also the new lands in Greece, and then there's the church in Crete. So we're already talking about within the Greek religious ecospace, a kind of pluralism that manifests itself, I guess, to quote Nico, a kind of messiness. And so as a consequence, we see I would say a hesitation to think about soft power, but I think that is changing as actors in the leadership in the Church of Greece, and I'm not talking simply about the synod, but at the meso level, recognize Russian activism and what that means for the church in Greece and beyond. The second thing I would say is that when it comes to the Church of Greece, and Greece being a member of the Transatlantic Alliance, and most importantly of the European Union, I think that there is recognition of the potential soft power that the Church of Greece wields in the EU context. But again, it's part of a broader discussion. But I do think that, paradoxically, for the ecumenical patriarchate, the condition of threat under which it lives inside Turkey, and the willingness to engage in ecumenical and interfaith activities to support universal human rights, freedom of conscience, belief, and religion, that has maximized in many ways. And also to speak importantly about climate change and climate disruption. The patriarch being the green patriarch, the commitment to theological understandings and activism on behalf of preventing further climate degradation, that has maximized the soft power resources of the ecumenical patriarchy.
Wow, great. One last question, Elizabeth, and this comes from Peter Allen. Is there evidence that the Russian efforts have had a success with the Greek Athos monks and monks elsewhere? So do we see monasteries around the Orthodox world adjusting or complying with Russian influence and directives?
Yeah, I'm going to not kick the can over to Nico, and not put you on the spot, Nico, but you can probably answer this in more granular form than I can. But I think the simple answer is yes. I don't know, not complying with directives, but sharing a particular theological interpretation, yes. Critiquing ecumenism and ecumenical relations, yes. Seeing ecumenism as a kind of, dangerous and deviant modernism, or, willingness to submit to, the Pope and Roman Catholicism and the Vatican, yes. I mean, and that's open. I mean, that's in some ways the interesting feature of the move to use sharp power and digital technologies, because a lot of these debates are now available online. So yes, there are definitely those, abbots, monks, monasteries who hew and hoe towards the Moscow perspective, as there are those who reject that and critique it. And there again, I think what's important is to recognize, one, that there is a competition for influence. And what does influence mean? It means, doctrinal, theological, discursive, approaches that then have consequences for broader social norms, values, and behaviors. And it also means influence building for geopolitics. And then the second point I would make on this is that the openness of these disagreements, not that they're all open, but we can access many of them, speaks to the pluralism and the diversity within orthodoxy, which goes back to this point about, the long-standing tendency in social science scholarship either to ignore orthodoxy or to orientalize orthodoxy, and participate in a kind of bigotry and racism that and othering that we're beginning to see people move beyond. But I think that's important in the historiography in terms of history and the social sciences. So I'll go to Nico, because I think you can answer with granularity.
Actually, I agree with Elizabeth myself. I think the orientalization is going on, especially in the last 6 weeks. There has been an upsurge of orientalization of orthodoxy, which is particularly disturbing. As for the success, it depends on how you define it, as Elizabeth also sort of defined the different kinds of success there in her answer. If you are talking about renovating your monasteries, your sort of physical plan, there has been huge success. But honestly, I don't know if that means anything, and I will tell you why. Because 19 out of the 20 monasteries of Mount Athos had in fact had gotten money from the European Union, which was called the Antichrist, in some of the 90s. kind of demonstrations against it. So they had absolutely no problem. I think it was only, I may be wrong on that, Constantinitu monastery that refused to get money for that, but I may be wrong on that. So the kind of sort of physical plan, give us money and we will put an icon up there of you. This is sort of, yeah, it happens all the time, great success there. In terms of the actual message, the whole sort of campaign against ecumenism was there in the 70s, in the 60s. I remember growing up in the 1980s in provincial Greece myself, the newspaper Orthodoxos Typos, I have no idea if it's still coming out, but in wonderful, wonderful Katharevousa Greek, you know, was sort of propounding on the awful sort of results of ecumenism. So in some ways there, I think Elizabeth is right, they are reinforcing the kind of argument each other there about ecumenism, it would seem to me. In terms of actual, I would say, individual relations as well between what I think we call Russian oligarchs, as if we don't have American oligarchs or Greek oligarchs, you know, kind of thing. I think that there is a lot of individual relations there, but I think that what saves Mount Athos is the very kind of individual monastic self kind of existence there, if you wish. They are a community, but they are also so individualistic in their approach that every time they arrive at the point where they see kind of danger of being sort of controlled, they seem to be stepping back. And I know I'm talking about now totally impressionistically, but you see that in the 19th century, you see it in the 20th century. And from what I understand, there have been such cases. So in the 21st century as well. So I would say physical plan, huge success. Actual theology, the Russians are still lagging far behind in terms of formulating the actual message. And the kind of independence or sort of affecting the kind of message that about modernism and, you know, traditionalism, no. Sort of Athonite monk is going to come out and talk about women's priesthood in the Orthodox Church. They are never going to sort of say that, right? They are not going to come out and support it or something like that, or they are not going to come out and sort of talk about the primacy of the civic identity versus the religious identity. There, I'm not sure, in other words, that the Russians are actually doing anything other than reinforcing an existing message. Thank you.
Can I add a footnote to the longest footnote, George, to this? One is, you know, Nico, I think, points out something really important. The willingness, for example, of the Athonite monasteries to, you know, get structural adjustment monies and development funding from the European Union as they are from the Russians. That speaks to a kind of, you know, transactionalism and opportunism, call it transactionalism at best, opportunism at worst, that in other circumstances we might say, you know, reflects a kind of rational actor model. Here are my interests, here I can maximize them, and I will engage in transactions that allow me to maximize my interests. So I would, you know, say that, number one. But then that leads to the second point, which is how do we measure influence? And this is, you know, the next part of the research is, you know, for me as I continue. How do we measure qualitatively and quantitatively influence? What are the metrics we can use? And how do we chart that longitudinally? And there I would say, you know, in particular, we need to look at changes in theology, you know, and the hegemonies of competing types of theology, theological interpretations. And there we see key issues that are, you know, important. One, the issue of you know, ecumenism. Two, the question of gender in the church. And three, issues related to climate change. Those are just three big ones. There are others we could talk about. And then four, the other metric is qualitative institutional, and that is leadership. And who speaks for these Orthodox churches and what kind of discourse they use and theology they support. So that's the measurement issue, which I think, you know, remains to be more fully developed. The other thing I would say in terms of, you know, possible explanations or issues to consider for how to measure accrual of influence. In terms of the old world patriarchates, I think, we need to recognize that in terms of the four ancient, of the five patriarchates, the four in the East, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. I mean, these are churches that, face real existential threats. And they face those threats because they live in under regimes that are either, secular, meaning anti-religious, and here I would say Kemalist regimes in Turkey, which were Jacobin anti-religious, number one, or number two, they live in either ethnic or religious majoritarian regimes that again do not accept pluralism, and that either through active persecution or passive discrimination, but structural and systemic discrimination, are producing the decline, if not disappearance, of these churches. Why does that matter? Because when questions of survival are at hand, then choices are constrained by those. And that's where Moscow has, both discursively, but in terms of its financial impact, said, no one else is helping you. We will help you. We'll help you build your church, rebuild your church, provide security, etc. So that brings us to the issue of policymaking, what the international community can do. And this goes back to a question that another viewer asked about sort of who should engage on these issues. Well, here's where international organizations, and here's where the US, in terms of its own foreign policy, become important. Develop some religious literacy to understand that these churches actually still do exist. They're not simply, museum keepers. They're connected, their sites are connected to, struggling but existing living communities, and that, they face human security needs that can be supported through development assistance and other forms of assistance. And those then have consequences for these other types of influence building. So I'm sorry, that wasn't really that wasn't a footnote, it was a long intervention. But
that was great. I have one suggestion for both of you, since you are the scholars related to this topic. Maybe direct a School of Management or economics student to study Mount Athos as a prototype of business management. I think it would be a great topic. And
Giorgio, if I may interrupt you, there is actually a book that has come out by a Greek economist, O Monachos Manager, the monk manager. So I think that it has been done already.
Okay. Then the other question, and I'm not going to pose it seriously, Elizabeth, but maybe think of, has the Russian church made any inroads in Orthodox communities in the US and Canada? It's a crucial question. That would be in terms of splintering the American consensus when it comes to religion. That would be a great way to infiltrate and intervene here. I don't know if that has been happening or if it's been reported or not. I don't know if they gave money to any Greek churches here. I just Googled the St. Nicholas Chapel, and there is some Russian connection, but it's not money. It's the relics that were there when it was built. What was in we got some relics from the last Russian Tsar. But has the Russian church been an instrument of infiltration in the US? Is another question that maybe in the future we can develop it, unless you have a few concluding remarks to bring
I think the US is like any other space, a geospace. It's important for Russian influence building, using religion as a kind of influence tool. But the US is really interesting because it is such a competitive, religious environment.
Yeah.
It's open to anybody, frankly, and not simply Russia. So I would leave it. I would leave it at that. For now.
Let's leave it there for now. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody. We've just made it 1 minute before 2 o'clock, which is very generous of both of you to be available for this time. And I hope we follow up with something else. Maybe next year, maybe a panel, maybe a mini conference, but I'll be very happy to expand this conversation. I think it's something that also the community has been asking for in the last 10 years or so, and we have been responding, but I think not adequately. So, Elizabeth, you have opened up a new avenue for us, and we would love to have you back. And Nikos, thank you also for participating today. It's been a great conversation, and thank you everybody who has been with us since the beginning, and even if you left in the middle. We will post this talk on YouTube once we download and edit it. And so if anybody you know has any interest in it, please get back to us and I'll direct you to the link. So thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Nico, and thank you, Yorgo. Thank you for your generosity and for hosting.
Elizabeth, if you want to stay for a minute, I want to sort of thank you personally.
Thank you to the audience, too, for the great questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful.